This is Net Video. I'm Jason Romney. We're at the Cross Media Lab in Singapore, and we're talking to Mark Meadows, who is one of the mentors at the Cross Media Lab and a man who's had an extraordinary career across the area of games, movies, books, artificial intelligence, engineering in a wide variety of areas. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Mark, could we talk at first about the kind of work that you've been involved in, because it's such a fascinating and wide spectrum.
Yeah, I'm trained really as a painter and as a writer. I think of myself as a painter that's able to run a computer and a pen, as well as a paintbrush, I guess. And essentially I began my educational work in philosophy and then moved more and more towards the fine art as I got more and more determined to kind of follow the higher dreams. In 1993 I ended up out in the Bay Area, and I was lucky enough to help design the third commercial web server that went up at well.com. And it was around that time that I began to notice that there was an opportunity to sort of weld together the fine art work interest that I had and this kind of new technology that was emerging. Now, of course, since I'd been playing Dungeons & Dragons since the age of 13 or 14, it was also completely conceivable that I was going to end up doing video games, so at the time I didn't really know it. In '95, I helped with the Interactive Media Festival as their online director, and we set up this really interesting space where there were a lot of people that were showing work that really was utilizing technology in an artistic manner and considering interactivity as its own medium, just as you might say consider oil paints or watercolors as their own medium. And that really served as kind of an inspiration point for me and sort of set the tenor for my career, I think, in many ways. From there I went on to start Construct Internet Design, which was a company that was essentially a virtual reality company. We were doing work for Microsoft and for Netscape during the browser wars. Both of them were our clients and they were competing, and so we really had this opportunity to see sort of how the industry was functioning on the back end. And we hired a group of musicians and architects, illustrators, character designers, some really excellent engineers. And the company did fantastically for the 3 years we had it. We then sold it.
What years were they?
1995 to 1998.
So that was the era of Vermal,
yes.
The virtual reality markup language.
Yes, and in fact we built the, as far as I know, it was the first public VRML site that was implemented. Mark Pesce and Tony Prisi came into our office with a guy named Owen, and Lisa Goldman was friends with Mark from years ago, and so in 94, it was 94, I went back over to the well and got together a group of volunteers, and we basically stayed up late and we were eating pizza and trying to figure out how this specification worked and put together this show in Vermal.
Now, when you say the well, you mean the Whole Earth Electronic Link, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And were you involved with that as well?
Yeah, I was there helping them design the graphical front end for their website. And it was really an interesting opportunity because there weren't background colors. We couldn't center text on the page. We could put images there. And so it became a real interesting challenge to, over a 9600 baud modem, present people with a graphical representation. And that was, I think, really the beginning of, for me, learning how the constraints of technology actually serves the benefits of imagination. The more constrained you are, the more imaginative you have to be. And I love that kind of claustrophobic thinking. It's really nice. So yeah, it was the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which was essentially a bulletin board system that was set up for people to exchange ideas, and ended up being a very strong writers community.
As a Renaissance man, someone who is a painter and a student of psychology as much as an engineer, you have a unique capacity in many ways to engage with the increasing overlap of the disciplines needed for games. Now, one of the areas that you've mentioned to the Cross Media Lab here in Singapore you're interested in is psychoanalysis and psychology. Can you talk about how that has influenced your involvement in artificial intelligence and games?
Oh yeah, well I'm glad you asked it. I mean, this to me is really one of these points at which new technology requires a redefinition of old skills. Just as developing websites for the early days of the web required graphic designers to consider the visual design of information, I think that as characters become more and more important in our interfaces and in our video games, we need to turn to psychologists and portrait artists, people that understand how to represent personality. So psychoanalytical profiling for me also has a lot to do with understanding how the player or the user of an experience is feeling themselves at the time. If I'm playing a game and I'm stuck in a maze and I can't find my way out, there's nothing as frustrating as that. I think the system needs to know how I'm feeling. The system needs to recognize that I'm frustrated and then provide me with a solution.
For people who have been brought up on literature and film, there's often a strong feeling that games can only produce sordid stereotypes and the crudest representations of the subtlety and dynamics of human psychology. Is it your feeling that games are actually going beyond those crude stereotypes now to something which is subtle and rich in the colors it can use to paint human psychological states?
Well, we're getting there. We have a ways to go still. It seems to me as though games are primitive primarily because we are learning how to take interactivity and map that on top of human interaction. In other words, let me back this up. I think that early literature had a lot to do with war and with this kind of slash and stash mentality of you go out, you fight your battle, you kick some ass, you take the gold, you run home with it, okay? That's a very simple, perhaps the simplest form of human interaction. As literature progressed, we saw more and more complicated forms of interaction. For example, in the history of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, we have, multiple interactions between multiple people in a world of magic. And then finally, with the essay, like Michel de Montaigne or James Joyce, you have that first-person point of view out on the world that I think kind of blogging has picked up on. So if I look at the history of video games, it seems to me as though we are having to go back to the earliest forms of interaction between people and map on top of that an interactivity with the medium. And so we've started in the simplest, safest place. That is slash and stash. I think that video games have been fundamentally about battle because battle is the simplest form of story you can tell. I've been playing a lot of Fahrenheit, it's also called Indigo Prophecy lately, and it might actually be a romance. We're seeing more and more subtle and nuanced interactions between characters. We're beginning to see that they have some interest in each other and that they also have an interest in the problem that they're faced in the story. And so I think that kind of evolution is going to be continuing. And so that's really been, for me, an encouragement to continue in the work that I've been doing for the last 7 years in artificial emotion and artificial intelligence and essentially just character development.
Also at the Cross Media Lab here in Singapore is Professor Katie Salen from the Parsons School of Design, who's talked about the use of the game engines that power games like Halo for telling other types of stories, this machinima movement. Is that something that you've explored in your work?
From time to time. Myself, I don't build machinima files myself, but I do occasionally help with these interactive narrative labs, and I was in Budapest just last week with Mediamatic, and there were some folks there that we were using Halo to actually create some versions of video files that people were using. And I think for myself, I'm more interested in glitching. I like to see how people. I enjoy playing Halo with friends, and especially kids that are 10 to 13 years old who were really, really good at the game. These guys have incredibly high clan rankings. They have a way of playing the game that is something, it's a form of reinvention of play. And I really enjoy kind of watching how they're breaking the existing system there. Machinima is interesting, I love it, and I think it's an excellent way to kind of take interactive media and repurpose it back up into this kind of non-interactive, very linear format. I wish I thought more linearly sometimes, because I think I'd probably be better with those sorts of media, but I don't do that much.
Now, Mark, you travel throughout the world, and you had a close brush with possible death in Iraq recently. Is that right? Or describe a bit of that adventurism.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of what I try to do is to kind of push limits and find out where the borders of my abilities are. I'm probably like this plant that's growing too much in different directions, but what happened was I was in Sri Lanka, and I was working on a book there that is just getting published by Soft Skull Press called A Portrait of Sri Lanka. And I was interviewing Tamil militants and Sinhalese bureaucrats, heroin dealers, people that like farmers, rice farmers, and just folks that I met working in the train stations. I finished writing that book looking at this country that was in a period of change, and while I was there for several months, my own country decided to invade Iraq. Not being terribly pleased with these circumstances and also not trusting the media that I was being fed, I decided to go see for myself what was actually happening. A dear friend of mine is Iraqi, and his family needed some letters and some money to be delivered, and I said, why don't you let me take care of this? We faxed over some letters, we wired in some money, I stuffed the money in my boots and the letters in my pocket, and I hitchhiked from Kuwait City up to Baghdad in May of 2003, when the museums and libraries and schools were being burned and looted. And it was an interesting experience for me. I think to some degree it was proof for myself that people around the world are much nicer than we're led to believe. And even in a war zone in which ostensibly I could be considered the enemy, putting myself sort of right on the train tracks of danger, I instead met with people who were incredibly gracious and very helpful, and I felt very almost blessed by the opportunity to be able to help them as well by bringing in the letters and the money to this family and offering some medical care to some folks that needed it while I was there also.
So not only did you put arguably your own life at risk to help out that friend, but it's also interesting from the viewpoint of the United States with Homeland Security and the Patriot Act and everything.
Yeah.
Do you feel that as an American citizen doing that kind of thing, you're actually holding out your hat as a person that your own government might be watching and worried about? I'm
fairly convinced that I'm being watched. I travel too much for a normal American, I mean, only it's something like 20% of Americans even have passports. So the fact that I'm traveling where I am traveling, I'm sure brings some attention to me, and I hope it doesn't turn to something that prevents me from doing the things I want to do or actually limits my freedoms. I suppose on some level I trust my government in that way to be gentle with me. I also consider myself to be an ambassador, and I think that there are a lot of Americans that need to have a better understanding of what the rest of the world is like, and I think it also helps for other people in the world to understand that Americans might not all be guns, God, and government all the time.
Now, you're also, in addition to traveling the world in that way and exploring those arcane areas of artificial intelligence and general software engineering, an entrepreneur, a business creator.
Yeah.
Speak a little, if you would please, about the kind of companies that you've been a founder of recently.
There was initially the company in 1995, Construct. Actually, I started Blowtorch Communications, which was in 1990, and it was essentially a graphic design and illustration firm that I was. I made 3 versions of myself. There was Rosa Rita Rabinowitz, there was Uncle Rat, and there was Mark Meadows, and all 3 of us actually did different work, and that was probably the beginning of my career of schizophrenia. In 1995, I launched Construct Internet Design with Lisa Goldman, and in the last 2 years, I have been helping with a game studio called Big Game Studio, and that was started by Rick Galvin, and I've been there to kind of help on the creative front. I also launched Area 10 in November of 2004, in which we're developing interactive characters. And then I also started Traction, which is it's a non-profit arts organization that's based in the United States, and the goal of that company is to work with artists that are exploring media limitations and looking at different ways in which multiple media forms can be combined and showing their work internationally for the sake of building stronger and stronger international ties. So with each of these companies, fundamentally what I'm doing is I'm trying to build a platform so that myself and other friends of mine that are making things, whether they're video games, whether they're paintings or books, have something of a platform to stand on. I find that a lot of this work doesn't necessarily provide us with the support that we need. I think in Australia and in Singapore, we're very lucky to have government supporting us here. In the United States, we don't have that same fortune, and so in a way you're forced to invent things that you might otherwise be provided with. And I think that's given me a lot of great opportunities in a way, because it's kind of like the boy named Sue. You know, you get kicked around enough and you get kind of tough as a result, and I think I've learned a great deal about it. Fundamentally, in order to be a good artist, you have to take your artwork as though it were really a career, as though it were really a company, and you have to look at bottom lines. You have to consider things like finances in order to, I think, actually do it right. And so it's been a helpful school for me.
Area 10, one of the many companies that you founded, is very much about natural language processing innovations.
Yeah.
Some of our viewers may have dealt with the issues that have been thrown up by software they've tried to use, like Dragon Dictate, that translates their voice into text on the screen. But natural language processing is far more complex and intriguing than that, I think. What is your interest in it? How have you used it in Area 10?
Well, I think, Jason, I should probably differ with you just a little bit. I think that Dragon is doing something that is so difficult, I don't want to touch it. I won't come close to it. That's a fire that's a bit hot for me. What we're trying to do with natural language processing is entirely text-based. And that solves a lot of problems for us because, for one, we don't have to deal with things like an American accent, right? We also don't have to deal with things like background noise. We're getting a pure text stream. And so I think that 80% of the problems that might have to be handled for a human ear and mind to work with get eliminated that way. What we're doing is we're taking a string of text and we're running a syntactical analysis on it. We're looking at the grammar that's there, we're looking at the words that are being used, we are evaluating whether or not those kinds of sentences have been previously used, whether those ideas had already been introduced in the conversation. We're comparing that against a knowledge base that we have. And then either we're generating a response on the fly or else we're sending back a pre-scripted response. Our first draft of this software, this is still, a lot of it's still in works. I mean, what we're doing is we're working with clients that say, okay, we see that this software is in a tenuous stage, and they recognize that as an opportunity because that means that they have more say into how that software gets developed. Area 10 then puts our skills into helping them kind of meet those goals, and at the same time that provides us with a source of inspiration and money to keep kind of moving the work along. Jan Malice, who is actually going to be moving to Australia, is one of my founders in the company, and she's been great to work with because she's always like, it's working with these guys on this really practical level that's going to help us make this as good as it can be. So in essence what we're doing is we're building storytelling and conversational machines. They're emotional machines. These are machines that are able to portray a story, whether it's for a video game or whether it's for a corporation, and they're able to interact with the user, the viewer, the player, the reader, however you want to term that person. The conversant is the term we usually use, and I think the goal for us is to be able to build software that is not only sustainable, but software that actually gets better the more you use it. I'm tired of disposable software. I'm tired of upgrading things. I want to buy software, I want to use it, and I want it to learn as I use it. I want it to get better over the years.
And how does that relate to St. Elmo?
Well, St. Elmo is an interactive portrait. Now remember, despite all of the starting companies and traveling around, these are all ancillary activities. At the end of the day, I'm a painter who writes. St. Elmo is my effort at building an interactive portrait. So St. Elmo it's essentially a story about an angel that falls to earth and gets stuck here. He misses the bus back up to heaven, and he has to kind of learn how to deal with humans. And the story itself is there as a means of interaction. So an interactive narrative is a story that has something of a dramatic arc to it, but it's a story that the user, the viewer, the reader, the interlocutor can still have some control or influence over. And thereby having a little bit more association with the character and with the story themselves.
Now Mark, you're a mentor here at the Cross Media Lab in Singapore. What are your thoughts regarding the many projects that have come to you for advice while you've been here?
Well, it's excellent to see how there are two sides of this industry that are being addressed. Now, since I've worked at some of these research labs, I understand how there's a lot of goatee tugging, and there's this kind of forehead rubbing that goes on in which people are coming up with some brilliant ideas, but what happens is that there's no schedule and there's no budget, and so fundamentally these ideas don't oftentimes make it out into the market. There's an element of practicality that's missing. At the same time, I've worked in companies in which the house is on fire and the baby's getting eaten by the dogs, and there's demons coming out of the toilet. And those like absolute pragmatic concerns that really drive the production process, the schedule and the budget and the scope are so overriding that there is no room for imagination and there's no leisure to really invent things. Cross Media Lab, I mean, the thing that's nice about this is that there are both of these camps being represented, and there's a dialogue between the house on fire and the cool professor with the goatee. And to be able to see these two things mixing, I think, provides it with a tremendous amount of power. It's the dialogue between that academic and that practice, the academic world and the practical world, that really, I think, is helping everyone here solve very complementary problem sets. And I think Brendan's done a fantastic job of linking together people from around the world and giving all of us a great opportunity to learn and share ideas with each other. And it's an absolute honor to be here.
For you as an artist, the idea of having work displayed on the very small screens of most mobile phones must be kind of unsavory. Do you see the transition of content onto those small screen devices as being a negative for people with your talents?
No, actually, I see it as being a positive. I mean, you have to remember that I spent years making canvases, in some cases as tall as these ceilings. I really enjoy the experience of having a painting studio and throwing buckets of paint against the wall. I also like having enough real estate that I can very specifically articulate ideas on a canvas of that size. I find, however, that working with different media types really has more to do with solving problems, and the pleasure of understanding how to best represent ideas is something that I think drives me to do work in so many different media types. So in other words, if I'm working with a huge canvas or I'm working with a little screen, they both are pleasurable because they're so different from each other. And it's the invention process that I think serves as a great deal, it gives me a lot of inspiration, really, you know.
To the casual observer, your talents are somewhat distributed across contradictory areas. On the one hand, you're going out to war zones, leading the life of the macho adventurer, and on the other hand, you're doing things back in your office which are very intellectual and concentrated in nature. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for me, on some level, it's the experience that needs to be brought into the artwork that's being done, and I think that whether it's literature or visual art or computer interactivity, computer games are certainly an art form, there needs to be material that's gathered from the world, material in quotes as it's commonly used, and then brought back in. And I find that there's a contrast between the two that gives me a great deal of pleasure. I don't always like, for example, hiking through a desert where I haven't had a drink of water all day, any more than I like sitting at a computer for the 14th or 15th hour when I haven't had a bite of food all day. But when I do both of them, they help me enjoy and kind of appreciate the difference between them. And I think if we have a body and we don't use our brain, or if we have a brain and we don't use our body, we're only half a human. And so what I'm really trying to do is to find out how to best integrate myself and bring those experiences back into people that are reading my books or looking at my paintings. It's really, I think of myself as, I think that the role of an artist or an ambassador is in some ways similar to maybe a shaman, where my job is to go out and collect things that are beautiful and bring them back and give them to the people that I live with. And so fundamentally the books are about that. They're about exploring new areas and trying to bring back information that's helpful to other people.
Are those images that you go out and bring back thematically linked in some way?
Yeah, it's all about portraying personality. I think that cultures are big people. Singapore has a personality that's different from Sydney. Sydney has a personality that's different from Los Angeles. And part of what I'm trying to do when I go to a place like Iraq or Sri Lanka or any country that I visit is try to say, this is the personality of this country, and maybe we can consider the country as though it were a very large person. So in that way, I still think of myself as a portrait artist, even though I'm writing books about countries that are in a period of intense cultural change. And that, of course, because I'm doing interactive portraits, that's another way of kind of trying to portray personality. And And doing figurative work and painting is also kind of along those same lines. So whether it's a book or whether it's a painting or whether it's a program, with each of them I'm trying to say this is personality, and these are, I mean, I love people. I adore people. On the abstract level, I'm a misanthrope. I mean, in a strange way, I don't people when viewed from a distance, but as I talk with individual people in my travels, I love the human animal so much, and I always want to try to find a way to express that in the work.
Mark, it's quite conceivable that there'll be young people watching this in countries around the world thinking, gee, what Mark Meadows is doing is exactly what I want to do with my life. If they are thinking that, do you need to become independently wealthy first and then take on the kind of lifestyle you lead, or is it actually possible to make a living from this sort of thing?
Well, I'm not independently wealthy. I mean, I think that the trick to it is to value your time over your money, and that recognize that you only have a limited number of heartbeats, and that they're getting smaller every minute. That number that you could write down on a piece of paper, as soon as you've written it down, you need to change the number, and it's not going up. I think that what I try to do, I'm not a wealthy man, but what I try to do is make sure that I am spending as little money as possible so that I have as much time to do the things that I enjoy. That's my kind of financial advice. I would also suggest to anybody who would be thinking about doing this kind of work, that is anybody who's really dedicated to being an artist, is that it is a very long and very hard path, and you need to write your dream down on a piece of paper and put it in a bottle. You can take it out later and look at it, but always remember what that dream is and never waver from it. It was when I was 17 that I decided I want to do what I'm doing now. Here I am 20 years later, and I still feel like I'm falling short of where I need to be. But I am on the right path. And I think that I would just recommend to people that they stick to their dream and have confidence in themselves. And no matter how hard it gets, no matter how broke you become, no matter what people say to you, just always have confidence in yourself and continue on that path at all costs. Because in the end, it's your life. You'll be the one that's dying, and so you should live the way that you want to.
Mark, you've covered so many areas in our discussion today. Thank you so much for coming on NetVideo.
It's my pleasure.
If people want to get in touch with you, what is your website and how can people contact you?
Well, first off, I think Boar.com is my website. You can spell Boar however you want. I've got it. BOAR.com is sort of the hub. BORE is also there, and BOOR. BOAR is the main website. My book, Pause and Effect, is a book about interactive narrative and some of the futures of emerging forms of narrative. And I'm also working on a book right now called Simulus Response, which is on digital humans. And as I mentioned, I've just finished my book on Sri Lanka called The Portrait of Sri Lanka with Soft Skull Press. My email address is pighead, as in head of a pig, @boar.com, and I would love to hear from you if you can send me an email.
Mark, thank you very much for coming on NetVideo today.
Thank you. Thanks, it's a pleasure.